All right, well, this is our workshop for assessment of student learning, particularly focused on designing effective assessment measures and sort of the considerations that go into choosing the measures for your assessment plan. And we are recording this today and we will share it via our website and Teams. In case you don't know me, I'm Amanda Warrenhoff. I'm the Director of Institutional Effectiveness and Assessment. And I have two colleagues who I also asked to introduce themselves. Allie.
I am Allie Michael. I'm Assistant Director for IEA.
And Gina.
Hi, I'm Gina McCullough, and I'm Quality Assurance Coordinator.
Thanks. Some of these slides, many of them are very wordy, so don't worry, I'm not going to read them to you, but we will share the slides so that you can have this sort of as a resource if you want to go back through some things. This page sort of just summarizes the very basic requirements for degree and certificate programs currently with IE. The summary is you need a set of program level student learning outcomes, 2 assessment measures for each outcome, and we ask that you assess at least 2 SLOs in each academic year. And then for the results reporting, you have to have results. You need to reflect on those results, identify actions, and discuss when you plan to implement those. On the left side is a link to our IE planning page, which has resources similar to this, along with other workshops we've done. If you just want to really watch Allie and I talk a whole lot, all those videos are on that. So by now you're probably familiar with the cycle of continuous improvement, the IE cycle. And today we're really focusing on that plan assessment part, the planning measures to assess your outcomes. The IE plans for next academic year for 23-24, which again, can't believe I'm talking about 2024, but here we are. Those are due February 15th. So we want you to start thinking about planning for our next IE cycle. So as I just mentioned, we really have 2 phases. We're sticking with that for now, that we ask you to turn into our office for tracking. There's the IE plan, and the next one will be due February 15th. And then the IE results report, and we're going to have those due September 15th. So one thing that's sort of newish to those of you that have been doing this for a while is that we have a simplified, we hope, timeline where plans for the upcoming year are due by February 15th and results reports are due by September 15th. And that's for all unit types, not just degree and certificate programs. As you probably know, our office also oversees IE assessment for non-degree units, which means every other office at the university, basically. So now everybody's going to be doing those 2 big times of year, at least for the next cycle. And we'll see how that goes. Some other resources we just want to point out. If you don't know already, we are not using Nuventive any longer as our assessment software. That has been shut off. We have pulled things out of there and we do have that available. You can reach out to Brandy Bickham if you need access to anything that was in Nuventive. We had to pull out all the reports manually, and lucky for her, she was the one who did that. So she's got it all stored somewhere. And we will eventually make it so that folks can access that themselves. We're just trying to find the best way to store all those files. And so in place of it, we are currently using what we're calling kind of a homegrown system using Microsoft Teams. So we do have other trainings on the Teams that are posted on our webpage that are recorded. And we also have a PDF tutorial on there if you want to look at that. And the Teams just gives us a way to share files, for you to submit files, for us to store plans that everyone has easy access to because the university already uses Teams. But if you need help or training on that, please reach out to me or Allie or Brandy. We're happy to walk you through how to use it. Everyone who's a chair, dean, associate dean, or assessment coordinator has access to the Teams already. But if there's anybody else who would like access, they can just reach out to us, and it takes 2 seconds for us to add that person to the Teams. All right. Okay, so before we dive into measures, let me just pause there and say, any questions about the Teams, the system, the access, whatnot?
Is this something where eventually we're going to be moving everything onto Watermark too?
You know, I don't know the answer to that, but it has come up. That probably will not happen until after our SACS reaffirmation in 2024. So if we did go with Watermark, we're going to be doing this for at least one more cycle as sort of an interim measure. We're actually having a demo on that soon, so we'll see. I mean, it may be, the nice part about not using Uventive is we're saving a lot of money. And my guess is the Watermark assessment tool is also pricey, but we'll see what they have to offer us. So it'd be nice to have one system, but we'll see. Other questions about that process? Great. All right, so before we dive into measures, quick refresher on SLOs, student learning outcomes. One thing I wanted to emphasize here is that really what programs should have is a set of program level outcomes. We recommend 3 to 8. People have different numbers for all sorts of different reasons, accreditation and whatnot, but it should be a set list. So there was sort of an idea that programs should choose new outcomes every IE cycle. That's not really how it works. I think part of that was in place because we just needed people to get things done in a quick manner. But really, you should have sort of a set list of these are our program level outcomes, whatever 4, 5, 6, 3, whatever those are. And then you can decide which ones you're assessing in any given year. And if you are struggling with where to get your SLOs because you don't have a specialized accreditor, Google is your friend. Look at other institutions. There's usually good ideas out there. Sometimes your professional organizations have good SLO ideas. And if all else fails, you can reach out to us and we're happy to talk through ideas for revised or different or new SLOs. Even though you would have that sort of static list, it is a good idea. And most programs do kind of look at their outcomes every year and say, are these still current for us? Do these still fit what we're doing? And often those need to be revised even just a little every year or a few years. So in terms of measures or methods, we use those terms interchangeably. For us, there are really 2 types of measures, direct measures and indirect measures. So direct measures are those things where you're really looking at a student product and assessing their work in some way or performance. Indirect measures rely more on self-reported learning, or they are sort of a reflective tool that or self-assessment that students might do about their own learning. So that's an indirect assessment. We asked that every program have 2 measures for each program SLO. That became very helpful during the pandemic when sometimes one of them wasn't able to be enacted. At least you had one to fall back on. So that's one reason that we asked for 2. Another is that 2 different methods just give you a more well-rounded look at how you're doing with that outcome from different angles. But I know that sometimes programs struggle to come up with that second measure. So if you are struggling with that, hopefully this presentation will give you some ideas, but if you need other ideas, we're happy to help you talk through that. For each measure, when you're writing out your plans, try to be as specific as you can in describing what that measure is so that someone outside your program can understand what it is. So a location, where is it happening? Is it in a course? Is it outside of a course? Is it a major field test? Is it a clinical experience? And what's the actual method and how specific can you be about that? So is it an exam? Is it a portfolio? Are you giving students a survey? What is that? Where is that happening? And if you want to, you could specify sort of which students are taking that assessment. So sometimes it might be every student in that course, but sometimes if it's an out of course thing, it might only be students doing this part of the program or that part of the program. You just want to be as specific as you can about that. At least, this is sort of another thing that I'm trying to be more specific about. At least one of the measures that you identify should assess as many students as possible at the end of the program. So in the past, I think programs have really gotten the message here at Austin Peay that all of your assessment methods need to be of only graduates at the end of the program. Yes, one of them should be a direct assessment of students at the end of a program, ideally a direct assessment. But your second measure could be elsewhere in the program. It could be an introductory course. It could be a midway course. Maybe there's a big kind of gateway research methods or something that majors take that you want to know how students are doing. That could be your complementary measure on that end of program measure. Because often what we find when you have two end of program measures is that it's hard for you to know where to implement improvements because all you know is how students did at the end. But if you had an end of program and a midpoint or an introductory, you could, even though those aren't the same students most of the time, maybe always, it still gives you a sense of where students are at different points in the program. So if you haven't heard that message in the past, I want to encourage you to think about assessing at different points in the program, especially for that second measure. You don't have to do that, but it's an option. The other reason that's helpful is because a lot of programs don't have a ton of courses that every student is required to take at the end of the program. Once, maybe they've offshot into their different concentrations or specializations and they're all in different, so it's hard to capture everybody, but everybody takes the intro or everybody takes the methods or whatever that is. Sometimes it's easier to capture more students that way with a common assessment. Targets. So target is that sort of achievement indicator that we ask you to identify for each measure. Really, that's just so that you have a lens through which to know what to do with those results. So that threshold is not at all determined by us. Frankly, we don't really care that much what it is. We just want you to have one. What we usually say, if you don't have historical data or an outside entity telling you what that threshold or target needs to be, that you should aim for realistic but slightly aspirational. So, we don't want to be D students. So maybe something that's more like a B, at least, maybe 80% of students will do this well. And those are movable later. So if you find that you've shot too low and everybody's just killing it, you can increase your target the next time to see. That's an action you can take based on your results if everybody meets that target. Or if you feel like no one's meeting this target and we're never going to get there, then you might want to adjust it back down to a more reasonable level. But hopefully those targets come from some kind of experience or knowledge that the faculty teaching in the program have of where they would like students to be and where they think students can get to at the end of a program, or if it's a mid-program or entry level, what you expect from them at that level. Move my little window. So as we move into more specific measures, I just want to note that this comes up a lot, especially when we do the Assessment Redesign Institute and folks have a little more time to kind of delve into exactly what they're doing when they deploy these assessments. It really matters how that assessment is designed and how it's communicated to students. Where, when, how seriously they take it, whether it's for a grade or not. All those are considerations that there's no right or wrong answer. Those are just things you need to keep in mind. If there's something that's going out in multiple sections of a course and it's not well communicated to those faculty, or you don't really know if people are implementing it this way or that way, that can affect your results. That's okay. It's not a perfect world, but it is important to note that in your results and in your analysis that there might have been some issues with the way that it was applied, or maybe you want people to apply it differently. But being aware of the fact that the way it's communicated, how much variability there is in the way that students are receiving or getting this information about this assessment, whatever it is, matters when you look at your results. Okay, some considerations. So again, these are wordy, so I won't read through all these. But it is important to think about whether or not the assessment that you're using, whether it's an assignment, a test, some kind of rubric or instrument, is that aligned with the outcome you're actually measuring? That might seem basic, but a lot of times we pick a measure because it's easy, or because it already exists, or because Professor X is the only one that teaches this course, and this is the assignment that he assigns, and that's what we're going to use. That's all fine, but if it isn't actually measuring the outcome, you're going to have issues identifying actions. So it might be a good time to just have a conversation amongst yourselves about, okay, what, or maybe you don't know what that person is doing exactly. Like, have you seen their rubric for that assignment that you're using for assessment? If you can have that conversation, the planning stage is a good time to have it. In terms of an exam or a rubric or even a survey that you're using for indirect assessment, it's good to plan on an item level analysis rather than just, 90% of students got it 85% overall in this exam. You might want to dig down deeper into questions or maybe groups of questions, like maybe you have 5 or 6 exam questions that are about this skill or subject. Same with surveys, maybe you have 5 or 6 questions that are about this sort of subtopic. Try to get in there and look at the results a little more granularly, because it will help you state where you're seeing strengths and weaknesses rather than students' overall performance. We're going to talk about that a little bit more related to major field tests, if that's something that you are trying to use for IE assessment. Ideally, more than one instructor is collaboratively designing that measure. It's not just one person teaching one course. I realize that that's not always practical or doable, that maybe there really is just one person teaching that course and there is no way to not do that. But at a minimum, if the results can be disseminated and discussed among the program faculty beyond just that professor or just that faculty member or instructor, that's a step toward making it more well aligned, even if you can't really dive into their assignment or their rubric or their exam. At least you can collaboratively discuss the results. We talked about some of this already, so I won't harp on it too much. But one of your measures should be that end of program, let me capture as many graduating students as I can, which is why a lot of programs like to use the major field test that use one. But again, it can occur earlier. And it may be necessary to have a common assignment in different courses if you're trying to capture people at the end of a program who are taking different sort of higher level courses. So that doesn't mean that, if you have sort of 3 senior level courses that students in different concentrations are taking, it doesn't mean they all have to do the same exact assignment, but it could be an assignment that has similar facets or sort of common skills, even if the content is different. There are ways to do that. It is tricky, and that's something we're happy to walk you through if you need to think about that. As best you can, we need you to try to capture all locations and modalities in whatever assessments that you're doing. That's kind of a SACS thing. Well, it is a SACS thing, that kind of. It's good to be able, we need to be able to show that whatever you're using for program level assessment, you are capturing students who are in online or hybrid or at Fort Campbell or at satellite sites, whatever that may be. So that's not relevant for every program, but if you do have a program with students who are engaging with courses in different modalities that you have assessments embedded in, make sure that you note that you're kind of gathering data from all different places and modalities. Okay, so before I dive into the direct measures, I'm just going to pause and say any questions so far.
Going back to picking our 2 outcomes out of our 3 to 8, are we supposed to rotate those each time, or is it good to have maybe one that you do a few times in a row to see progress across years, or how should we do that?
I think that really depends, Brad, on how many you have overall, and I guess what you are trying to do with those. So that's kind of an it depends question. But in general, I don't think you want to go more than 3 years, I would say, before you measure any outcome again. That seems too long. So if it's an undergrad 4-year program, I should say that. So it's less, if you want to have sort of that longitudinal year by year data on an outcome, then yes, you should do it more than once in a row. But there are some outcomes that might be more holistic, that are, less variable over time. So I don't really have a direct answer on that. It kind of is whatever you want.
Okay, just want to make sure there weren't like restrictions exactly, or you can talk
No.
about what we want. I want to make sure what y'all want to from this.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think what we want is that, if you have 6 outcomes for your program overall, you should have data on all of those within 3-4 years maximum, because otherwise it's too long of a lag to make changes that could affect students going through the program.
Okay, thanks.
Other than that, no real restrictions. All right. Again, I won't get too detailed on this, but just some things to point out about some of the most common direct measures that folks use. One is essays or written work that can take all forms. So that, is a more traditional essay. It might be like a quick lab report or something, some kind of written piece of work that students are putting together, or it could even be something like a PowerPoint or a web page or something like that. Ideally, multiple faculty members are evaluating that student work using a common rubric. That does not always happen, but that is the ideal situation. In some cases, it has to just be one faculty member assessing that work for a variety of reasons. And in that case, again, I think the important thing is that the results are discussed among more than one person. Sorry, I hit the button. And that rubric that we use to assess essays or written work or PowerPoints or web pages, that rubric should be collaboratively developed and normed among the faculty teaching that course at a minimum. Again, if it's only one faculty member, it's still good to get departmental or program level input. But if there's more than one person teaching that course, it's important for them to understand how they should be using that rubric. And sometimes that can be a challenge if it's mostly adjuncts teaching that course. But you can do your best kind of putting together maybe an email for them to read about how to apply the rubric and inviting them to reach out to you if they have questions. But that rubric should be a point of conversation in the program. Tests and quizzes. Obviously, this might be the most common direct measure. The thing I will say about this, the two most important things are, one, often tests are used that are not aligned with the outcome that they are being used to measure, or it's not aligned well, or the alignment isn't clear to those outside of your program, which may always be the case, but you need to try to explain it a little. So sometimes on a test or quiz, only some questions are aligned with the outcome. That's okay. Just say that. Just say like only, X number of questions are aligned with this outcome, and we're using those results to measure this outcome. But sometimes the test is just used and it really is not related to the outcome at all. So you just want to make sure that the test you are using or the exam is aligned with that outcome you're trying to measure. Is it going to give you information that you can actually use to make decisions or identify actions? And similarly, the other thing is that, I'm going to harp on it again, that item analysis is important. So the overall score is important, but also how students did on particular discrete skills or pieces of knowledge is important, because that might help you know where to focus a change in curriculum or teaching a particular lesson, or maybe a different prerequisite or whatever that might be. Performances or presentations that might be an oral presentation, it might be a musical performance, any kind, something like that. Ideally, you have 2 or more faculty evaluating that performance. Again, that's not always possible. But at the minimum, the rubric used to evaluate that performance should be vetted by other people in the program, and the results should be shared as well to make sure that it's usable information when you get those results. So I want to dive into the major field test. I don't know how relevant that is to you, Marissa or Brad, but it's helpful to think about, and for others watching this on the recording. So Gina is on our session today because she's the wonderful human who helps us do all the things THEC makes us do for quality assurance funding, and major field test is one of those. So major field test is something that all associate and bachelor level programs have to do to evaluate their graduates. And we have to use THEC approved assessments, or in some programs, licensure exams. So they literally have a list of the assessments that we're allowed to use in different disciplines. And we are told we need to test at least 90% of all graduates, which is why Gina and I harp on everybody to make sure that they're doing this on a consistent basis. And then we report those scores for every program once a 5-year cycle, but we keep all the data for every semester and year that you do it. So there are standardized test providers, but there's also this locally developed option. So programs can also, within sort of these THEC process parameters, develop their own major field test. And we actually have, we're going to be having more programs than ever have a locally developed test, which is good because it means you have more control over the content, but it's more work, obviously, because you have to put it together and make sure that you have a mechanism to deploy it to students and all that good stuff. And programs do that differently. So considerations, if you're using the major field test for a measure, I'm not going to read these questions for you, but they are things you should be asking yourself. And the primary one is, does this approved assessment align with our SLOs in any way? Can it really help us measure them, or are we not sure about that? If it's a locally developed test that you've developed, it might have been developed a while ago and it might not match your current SLOs, or maybe it never matched your SLOs. So you need to think about that as well, even if it's a test that you've designed. And then I'm going to switch to this next slide. The pros and the cons. So pros are, it's a direct measure, often a standardized nationally normed measure, which is really solid. It's at the end of the program, and depending on how we deploy it, it usually captures all the graduates or most of them. That's great. It exists already. Our office pays for it. Hey, you might as well use it for something. And it allows for that national comparison if it's a standardized test, which could help you analyze your results, which is great, because that might help you identify actions or deficiencies that you might have when you compare yourself to national peers. And the locally developed tests, because they're developed by the program, could be perfectly aligned with the SLOs if it's done intentionally on the front end. Cons. These standardized tests are often designed in a way that's really proprietary and does not let us have access to what the questions are. And the questions sometimes change. So a lot of times the major field test will say, oh, we assess these 5 subject areas and here's what the questions could be, but we don't actually get to see what students were asked some of the time, or we don't have enough detail on that. It kind of depends on the provider, but that can be a real challenge to know how well aligned it is with your curriculum and your SLOs if you can't actually see the test at the granular level. The other thing is, Gina, I'm going to let you talk about the reporting, but sometimes we can't get the detailed level reports on the results that we would want. Is that right?
That depends on the test provider. ETS tests have given us a few more reports where we can do a lot more analysis, and you can even pick colleges you want to compare yourself to. So there's some new things that we're allowed to do, but with ACAT, I think it's only giving you a standard national norm comparison, and that's what THEC requires. So they're meeting exactly what THEC needs from us for quality assurance, but that may not be what you need for a measure.
Thank you. Yes. And the other 2 major things are, some of these standardized tests come with required third-party remote proctoring, which I'm sure many of you know is a challenge in and of itself. And that can really hinder your results if that's a big hurdle for students. And the other thing is that depending on how the program chooses to communicate the major field test to students, if it's not embedded in a course, if it's not part of a grade or how they do in a course, it might not be taken seriously as a course embedded assessment. Every program kind of communicates the MFT to students differently. In some programs, it's embedded in a capstone course and it's part of their grade. In other programs, they just kind of gather students, in a room and hope they take it. So it just kind of depends on how it's communicated. That's a consideration if you're going to use it for an assessment measure, because you want to think about how well what kind of solid information that's going to give you to make decisions. So the bottom line is, we just want you to think more carefully about using the MFT. We're not saying don't use it. We've just seen it used in ways that are actually not really helpful, because then the program gets the results and they're like, what do we do with this? So thinking about how to better align that is one thing we would like you to do. And I should mention, especially for the recording, major field tests are only for undergrad programs, so not related to graduate programs at all.
Can I ask a short question? So say we don't know what our major field test is or anything about it, to determine if it would be a good thing to use as a measure. Can we contact, who do we find out about that from?
You can contact Gina.
Okay, all right,
She will give you all the info she knows.
okay. I will probably be emailing you then. Thank you.
Yeah, that'd be great. All right, so now I want to talk about indirect measures, which I like a lot more. So I'm going to share a little bit of information about this because I really want to encourage folks to think about using more indirect measures if they aren't already. So here's why I love indirect measures. They are usually sort of focused on or can help with more deep types of learning for students. They're more resistant to cheating because it's usually just students reporting about themselves. So there's no like copying from the internet or anything. The other important thing is that actually there's a lot of research on this in the assessment world very recently, that they are actually more inclusive and culturally relevant for a lot of students. And they can help support equity because students are able to demonstrate their learning in a different way that is more accessible to them. That is not to say that they can replace direct assessments, but they are a really good complement if you can work it in. And they help you get more information from students directly about how they're feeling about their own learning in a course, if you can get it to be sort of a real measure that's done well. And they can help measure those nebulous outcomes. So sometimes programs have outcomes that are more developmental or attitudinal or ethical type things. Indirect assessments are sometimes better to get information on student learning for those more touchy-feely kind of things that are hard to assess with the direct assessment. But most importantly, they are good complements to your direct assessment. So I like the idea of a direct assessment and an indirect assessment together because it gives you kind of a full picture. That being said, you definitely cannot do indirect assessments on every single outcome. That might be too much work because they do tend to be a little more labor intensive, and that's something to think about. But in general, I'll let you read these later on your own, but there are things like reflection assignments, and I have a lot of strong feelings about reflection assignments. Being a writing teacher, I've done a lot of these and I've tried every which way to make them be rigorous and meaningful, and it's hard. But there is a lot of good information out there about how to make reflections actually mean something and not just like student BS telling you what you want to hear. And there are also ways to do it that are easier for instructors to manage and grade. Things like exit slips, a student just leaving and writing on a Post-it one thing that they're still confused about. And then you collect those and you still know what's happening with their sort of what's going on in their brains about the lesson that they had that day. Things like self-evaluation can be actually a kind of easier one. We had one program here at Austin Peay implement that recently in their clinicals. So the clinician observes the student and has a rubric that they use to assess the student's performance. And now the program as an indirect assessment gives that same rubric to students and they assess themselves. And then they kind of compare the results between what the students self-evaluated and what the clinician observed. And you can use that in any sort of, even on a paper, right? You can have a rubric where students evaluate themselves and a rubric that the faculty member use and kind of see how that goes together. Metacognitive activities is a big bucket, but some of the most successful ones that I've seen people use in assessment-related projects and in classroom research are exam wrappers. This works well in courses that are very content-heavy in STEM or in some of the other social science fields. They can be embedded in an exam where like it's actually an exam question about how they prepared for the exam, or there's little worksheets that students can do pre-post exam that give you more information about how they prepared and what they thought they did well or didn't do on the exam, or what one thing really tripped them up. Those can be a good complement to the exam scores themselves. And again, there's lots of good information out there about how to do that with minimal effort on instructors' part. And I'm happy to gather some of that information if folks are ever interested in like, how are they doing this in this field? I can try to pull as much of that as I can. And then the last one that I've been discussing with several programs that is maybe more of an out-of-class assessment, but could also be in a course, are surveys that actually ask them to reflect on their own learning. This is maybe a little more work on the front end to set it up, but once students take the survey about their experience in the program or their learning in the program, the results are easily automated through things like Qualtrics. This can be particularly good in like a grad program where you want to know about students' experiences and application to their professional lives or whatever that might be. But there are ways to use this to assess all your SLOs. You could literally just ask students, you know, rate your learning on this SLO, like literally put the SLO in there and ask them to rate it. I mean, it's self-generated, it's self-reflective. And then you could ask them some open-ended if you wanted to, but it gives you a way to kind of get complementary data that doesn't show up through exams and papers and stuff like that. I should mention, we do have a survey policy here at the university, and we have a committee that I'm on. I don't chair it, Dr. Andrew Luna chairs it. But if a survey is only used internally for assessment and that's it, you're exempt, you can just give the survey. So you don't have to turn it in if you're only using it internally for IE assessment. If you plan to use it for any other reason, like later you're going to do a conference presentation or work it into a scholarship of teaching and learning project, you're going to need that approval and maybe IRB too. But if you're just using it for program assessment, you're fine. You can give it. So again, some considerations about indirect assessments before you go down that road. Are these things that you want to be public, where students are sharing with each other in the class? I've done some that are like reflective presentations that we ask students to give in a class about their learning. Or are they private? Are they things that only you are going to see? Graded or ungraded, this is a big one. Because on the one hand, you want students to feel free to be honest in these reflections. So maybe that's ungraded. On the other hand, they don't take it seriously if you don't grade it. So it's a delicate balance. And again, coupled or uncoupled with the direct assessment. So do you want them to do the reflection the minute they finish taking the exam? Or do you want it to be the next day when they come back to class or whatever that thing is? And some of these other considerations are really about how comfortable you are giving indirect assessments and how comfortable students are doing them. So in some disciplines, this kind of work is very embedded and students are used to it and instructors are used to it. In other disciplines that are very direct assessment heavy, this may be totally foreign to instructors teaching the course or to students who are in those courses. So you want to consider that, thinking about a way to do an indirect assessment. Maybe a survey with a Likert scale is more comfortable for everybody than writing some, long reflection paper. So you have to think about what fits in your world and what you're comfortable doing and what students might be comfortable doing. So I just want to leave you with this quote as we think about equity and our assessments and making the world a better place. Just being even just mindful of the fact that your assessments are either promoting equity or they are promoting inequity, whether you intend it or not. Just having that in your brain, not using it to overwhelm you or make you feel bad, but think about maybe I should consider this when I'm assessing my students, even in just the tiniest bit. And indirect assessments are really a way to sort of easily balance the scales a little, to get different information from your students in a different way that might be a little more accessible for some of them for a variety of different reasons. So with that, I'll remind you of our deadline, February 15th for your 23-24 plan. And I will say, any questions for the moment?
I do have a couple other questions. So you said for the major field test, there's a like THEC approved, you can use any THEC approved like examination for things. Is there a list of those, or how do I go
There
about
is.
seeing if there are other options? Okay.
Yeah, Gina can share the list. Is that true, Gina?
Yes, THEC provides a list. Now, if your discipline is something that's not covered in that, then you can have the option of doing an assessment that best fits you through this locally created option. And there's a THEC form that gives you guidelines on how they want this implemented and lets you explain what you want to do and how you're going to proceed through it. So there's some guidance on how to structure that.
Okay. Because so we're in the mathematics and statistics department, and there is a mathematics field test, but more and more of our students are going into stats and actuarial science and aren't covering the material on that major field test. And it feels like we just keep getting further and further from, like that just keeps diverging from where our students are going. So
Yeah, I can see that.
possibilities.
Mhm.
Right. And I was also going to ask, you said about how you can implement these direct assessments at kind of any stage of, lower level, what would be like the first, upper level course, or like the capstone kind of thing. Is there concern if you do lower level ones though of having students like outside of the major in there? If what we want to do is assess the major itself?
Yes, that is an issue, but I think the best way to, unless you have an easy way to parse out the students who are majors, which you probably don't, it's better to just acknowledge it as a limitation when you're looking at the results. So when you're writing up your results, if you just say, yes, we know that there are students in this course that aren't majors, but theoretically, the outcomes or objectives of that course should be the same for everyone, whether they're majors or not.
Yeah.
In
Right.
theory.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think for us, it's just, that's too hard to parse out. So I think you just say, we recognize there are non-majors in this course, but here's what we learned from it. And it may be that you have a way to figure that out. I don't know, Brad.
I think it would be too hard if we did like say calculus and we have 6 sections of it trying to go
Yeah.
through and get it all
That's
sorted
too
out. Would be
much.
too tough to do.
Yeah, that's too much.
That was all my questions. Then.
Great. I wanted to point out that this page is actually our newly streamlined timeline webpage. There's a link at the bottom. And it also has information about the IE committee review process, which has developed over the past couple of years. So currently, right now, October, November, the IE committee is reviewing the results reports that everybody submitted in September. So by the end of this semester, our office is going to send you a feedback report with the committee's feedback on your results report from last year. And that should help maybe inform what you might do for next year. Maybe not, but that will be coming in December. And then after you all submit your plans in February, the committee will be reviewing those plans as well to give you feedback, and we'll get that feedback to everybody in May. And then with degree and certificate programs, if you want to revise that plan for next year, you do have an opportunity to do that by the first day of the fall semester. So you want to come back and meet during pre-semester and kind of reassess what your plan is, and you decide you want to make a change, you can resubmit your plan by the first day of the fall semester in 2023. So that's it. Typically, I work with the degree and certificate programs, and Allie does our 9-degree units, but we're both here to help. Gina is your resource for all things MFT, but I'm happy to help you discuss about whether or not that fits for IE for your program or not. And please reach out to us if you have questions.
Thanks.
Thanks, Brad. We appreciate you coming.
I'll thank you for the people watching at home too later.
Yes, exactly.